Okay, so this is an Excel Skills Academy looking at some basic skills that folks need for research methods. This is a continuation of the Excel 101 sort of formatting skills setup, where we're going to look at things that are a little bit more about data presentation than sort of changing the fonts and the shadings of things. And so I'll just begin with just something that's pretty foundational and I actually should have shown folks earlier, and that is sort of making data sort of usable and scrollable. And so one thing that I oftentimes do whenever I have data is that I put a header row in and I make the header row look like a different color, right? So I just go into my Control-1 Format Cells dialog box and I choose a fill. And so I did green before, but now I'll make it blue. And I click OK. And because I've highlighted this entire row here, it goes blue all the way across. Sometimes I put a solid line underneath. I also bold it oftentimes so I can tell that these are my headers, they're not data, and that helps me keep things straight. But if I start scrolling, that header line just disappears automatically. And that can be confusing, right? Because if I'm trying to figure out what are two different columns that maybe look a little bit similar, if I don't have that header row to tell me, this is what this information is, that can be frustrating. So Excel has a nifty little tool to help us sort of keep that a little bit more organized. And if we go up to our View tab, there is an option to choose freeze panes. And so if you click and choose freeze panes, there's an option to freeze the top row, there's an option to freeze the first column, and there's an option to kind of freeze all panes. It kind of puts like a little cross through your screen where multiple panels sort of stay fixed. I tend to just go with freeze the top row. The kind of data that I work with, that tends to be the easiest to sort of work with. If you have thousands of columns, maybe you want to keep track of unique identifiers on the left-hand column. I usually can just work with the fact that Excel numbers all of its rows. But this is something really helpful that even as I scroll down, I still have that header bar across the top. And that's a handy Excel trick that if you're going to be working with large data sets is pretty useful to have in your belt. I want to pivot now just very briefly and go to talking about this voucher that we talked about briefly before. This is a voucher that the University of North Dakota uses for student organizations, and I've made a slight altercation to it. Before, when you clicked into this row, it was basically everything was all in a single bar. And I've now separated it out into two different bars. And the reason is that I think most reimbursements come in a variety of different categories, right? We're reimbursing food, or we're reimbursing travel, or we're reimbursing like a registration. There's like set categories. And maybe I want people to categorize what it is that they're trying to seek reimbursement for beyond just giving me a description. And so one way that I could do that is I could just simply, put up in the bar above, category, and hope that people will enter things in. Maybe I could give them a list of possible categories and say, type that in. But there's a way in Excel where you can control the kind of things that users can put into cells in a way that allows for you to impose responses on them. And this ends up being really handy. And so the way that this works is we're going to do cell validation. And I'm going to create a space where I want all of my possible options to be presented. And so I'm going to have travel, food, I'm going to have supplies, registration. I think that's all the things I've ever asked for reimbursement for. Let's say speaker fees, rent, for rooms. I think that's good enough. Okay, so whatever you're reimbursing has to fall into one of these various categories. And again, I could put that out there and tell people to sort of put in what they wanted, but people might not. They might type things differently. Sometimes the things might be capitalized. They might try to put it in two different categories. If I want to control what people are able to put in, I can go into the cell that I want things to be placed into, and I can go into, I believe it's data, and I can choose this data validation option, which is basically saying we're going to create some rules over what you can actually put in this column, and it defaults to allow any value, which is normally a good idea. I can say it has to be a whole number, like you cannot put decimals in this if you want. I can say it has to be a date. Excel likes things to be dates. It tries to convert them to dates all the time. But in this case, I want it to be a list. I want it to be a list of very specific items, and you can only choose certain items. And I can leave ignore blank. In cell drop-down box, I'm going to check that because that's going to be really handy. If you don't check that, people don't know what are valid things that they can enter and what they aren't. But then Excel is going to ask me, okay, so you want a list. What's the source for that list? And so I can put my cursor in here and then click this little sort of go get your list data validation box. And I'm just going to highlight the items I want. And when I've highlighted the items I want, I think I can hit enter. I can click this little icon at the end, and it puts that selection into here. And then I'm going to click OK. Okay, and at first it doesn't look like anything's happened, but if I go and click on that cell, now something, if you look closely, has changed. There's this little arrow, this little drop down that comes next to it. And when I click on that, it gives me that list. And I can only put in items that appear on that list. Oh, but wait, what if I accidentally did when I wanted to get rid of it? Let's adjust that list a little bit. I clicked my data validation. This time I'm going to take ignore blanks off. I'm going to keep my list, and I'm going to go one higher. Now I've got a blank option, so I can clear that out if I decided, nope, I don't actually need that row. And that allows me to have all these different options available, and people can only choose things that I've predefined, and they're not going to spell things wrong, and they're not going to make up their own categories. And that can be really helpful in terms of controlling sort of what people do. Another way that I use this pretty frequently is I'll put a check or an X in one and a blank in another. And so if I'm done with an item, I can click onto it and put my drop down, and it sort of checks it off that that's done. There are reasons why you would want to control what people are entering in. So that everybody's using the same check versus some people are using an X versus some people are using a 1 to mark that something is done. If you have a very controlled input, you can write formulas to reference that controlled input, and people aren't going to break your formulas by doing things that you didn't anticipate because you've controlled what they can do, which is a handy little tool in Excel. The only other thing I would maybe add with data validation is that you now have your list kind of hanging out here. And so a handy little trick in Excel is not only can I resize cells and make it go like really small and try and hide it that way. That didn't work because I have them spilling over. What I can do instead is I can highlight a column and I can just hide it. And it's not gone, right? It's still there. If you look, it's AR and then it jumps to AT. If I want AS back, I highlight those columns and do unhide, and it gives me it back. But if people aren't looking closely and I hide those columns, they're not going to be none the wiser if there's something going on there. I can also do that with rows. I can hide rows if I don't want to have something visible. But I find hiding columns to be far more handy, and I use that quite a bit more. So data validation is a useful tool. It's not super complicated. It makes you look like your Excel sheets are a little organized and have had some thought put into them. And when we get into more advanced skills, being able to control and limit the kind of information people can put into your Excel sheets and into your data is very, very important.